Starting off, I want to look at the background and rationale for this presentation and for the workshop. The focus of this paper and the workshop as a whole is not only on compensation held in trust by prescribed bodies corporate, but also on trust holding funds for Aboriginal beneficiaries more generally, like mining agreements. Nonetheless, it's useful to begin with the observations about PBCs in particular to make a more general point. PBCs are established under the CATSI Act. It comprises over 600 pages and it focuses almost entirely on what it itself calls the internal governance of the PBCs. However, the matters most relevant to this paper and to the workshop are to be found in the PBC regulations. Specifically, what will likely be an increasingly important function for PBCs in holding native title in trust is set out in Regulation 6B, that is, to hold money, including payments received as compensation for native title matters, in trust. And in 6C, that's Regulation 6C, it says one of the functions is to invest or otherwise apply money held in trust as directed by the common law holders. And Regulation 7 has an equivalent thing for agent PBCs, identical functions. Now, how this direction is to be implemented is a matter for each trust. And that is, while the principles and mechanisms by which internal governance of the PBC is to be conducted are prescribed in compendious detail in the CATSI Act, the governance principles by which the common law holders are to, quote, direct their PBC to apply the money held in trust, and how the PBC is to engage with the native title holder beneficiaries in determining how the trust funds are to be utilised is left essentially unspecified. It's this arena, the governance of trust funds for Aboriginal beneficiaries, which I wish to focus on here and provides the overarching theme of this CNTA workshop. It's not that attention has not been given to this arena. For instance, trust deeds themselves set out a range of categories to which funds can be applied. For example, a range of, quote, charitable purposes like alleviating poverty, education bursaries, white goods subsidies, and what might be thought of as, quote, cultural objectives like supporting outstations or heritage protection. In what are represented as best practice mining agreements, a range of benefits are negotiated, which include such matters as best practice mining agreements, a range of benefits are negotiated which include such matters as unemployment and training, engagement of Aboriginal businesses, heritage protection and so forth, as well as direct payments to Aboriginal organisations who then manage their disbursement or utilisation. The key point to make here is that for most of these, people have to apply to the trust corporation or, as I've seen in one case myself, put their case to a general meeting of the corporation in order to have their wishes for access to trust funds considered. I'll make one other preliminary comment here, and it goes to something that Nick mentioned too. I'm mindful of the significance of a strengths-based approach to community development frameworks, and some of my observations here may seem unnecessarily negative, but that's not my intention. I'm not making moral judgments in this paper concerning supposed weaknesses to be found within contemporary Aboriginal societies in dealing with and managing trust monies. Rather, on the basis of my own observations over the years, I'm outlining what I consider to be certain deeply embedded ways of being in the contemporary world which Aboriginal people bring to bear in their engagement with PBCs and other trust corporations, and which, also in my view, have their origin, at least in part, in deeply ancient traditions, and may have challenging, problematic implications. But at the same time, they reflect Aboriginal people's strengths and resilience in coping with their contemporary worlds, and so are strengths-based in a rather more nuanced way. So I want to go to something that Nick mentioned briefly in his introduction. That's the socio-cultural features of beneficiary groups relevant at least to my arguments here. Key insights which anthropology can bring to bear to the arena of trust concerns what are typically distinctive social, political, ethical and economic values and practices which certainly have been impacted since colonisation, but, as I said, have deeply ancient origins. Key instances of these of relevance to the governance of corporations and trusts funds are discussed briefly in the following sections. I begin with localism, mentioned by Nick, since it's manifested in the expressions of autonomy in many forms of social and political life, notions of cultural authority and identity, and more specifically in views concerning representative boards in Aboriginal corporations. So, and a heading I've called the primacy of localism. In Australian Aboriginal societies generally, and not just those in remote regions, priorities given to values and interests asserted at the small scale, locally based or even individual levels. Strong emphasis is typically placed on the identities and autonomy of individuals and local groups, including those referred to by Aboriginal people as the families. Self-reliance and individual and local group autonomy are highly valued, and the political system is characterised by an intense localism. A key form of local group in Aboriginal societies is what they themselves term, and they've come into native title parlance, the families, which can be found across much of contemporary Aboriginal Australia, from remote regions to urban areas. These are not to be understood as referring merely to extended forms of the non-Aboriginal family structures, those of Australia as a whole. Anthropological research has demonstrated that these contemporary Aboriginal families can be seen in many areas as the successors to the landholding units of the classical Aboriginal societies, for example, the clans. They're defined through shared common descent from specific named forebears, while larger families may themselves comprise recognised subgroups identified by particular surnames, the Martins, the Smiths, etc., and defined in terms of descent from intermediate forebears from generations below those of the earliest remembered ancestors, and associated with particular regions or areas, particular countries. These families of polity, as the anthropologist Peter Sutton first termed them, are not the only structural feature of Aboriginal societies, but they do play a central role in defining and organising ethical frameworks and social, economic and political relations within the Aboriginal domain. Aboriginal families, then, are political and jural entities, not the private units of stereotypical Anglo-Saxon society. Disputes may involve focal individuals, but such individuals' positions in part rely on their capacity to mobilise members of their family networks and kin networks to their cause. Localism also has important ethical implications. A person's strongest ethical commitments are usually to their immediate kin and family, and those from other groups may well be viewed with a lack of trust, a degree of suspicion, or even on occasion hostility. A notion of the wider common good or shared, quote, community, or sometimes even down to the family, extended family level, can be relatively absent in such societies or groups. This has significant implications, I propose, for the governance of corporations and for how representative, in heavy inverted commas, structures seen as corporate, such as corporate boards, may be viewed by beneficiaries, and how the members of those boards may understand and enact their own roles. It's important to note here that while Aboriginal localism has most certainly been accentuated through much of colonial and more recent history, for example, the introduction of the welfare-based cash economy has had a major impact, in my opinion it has deeply ancient origins in the necessities of hunter-gatherer life, where people lived and moved for much of the time in small bands and where mutual trust and shared identity were keystones of everyday life. Political contestation and outright open conflict, and on occasion violence within and between Aboriginal groups, often centres on the legitimacy or otherwise of claims to rights and interests in traditional lands. One consequence of this strident politics of identity can be a continuing focus on the constant negotiation and renegotiation of relationships amongst individuals and subgroups within a complex and factionalised Aboriginal polity, rather than on engagement with the broader non-Aboriginal society, the society in charge. Another manifestation of localism is evident with autonomy, there's typically a strong resistance by individuals and local groups to being bound by the decisions of others, including those who nominally act for or represent them, and indeed a mistrust of ceding the management of their rights and interests to others, especially where, for example, country and money are concerned. This originates in part in the high value placed on the individual and local group autonomy, and on a resistance to hierarchy outside of the traditional religious or ritual arena. Aboriginal people are typically extremely cautious, in my experience, and even hostile to delegating authority, or moving it up the line really, to nominated or elected representatives. That is, the principles underlying representative democratic institutions, and also incorporated into organisational structures by which individuals or group delegate or cede their right to speak for their interests to representatives, do not necessarily operate within Aboriginal societies with ease. A person's occupation of a formal institutional position like chairman, board member, delegate or proxy does not necessarily give that person the authority within the Aboriginal system or legitimacy, most particularly, within that system of values to speak for others, to make decisions about matters that they see as their business only, and as I said, quintessentially about country and matters to do with monies. So I'll return to the implications of political and ethical localism for so-called representative boards shortly. So I just want to make a comment about language groups. A brief note here. For some purposes, for example for native title claims, language groups, or what are sometimes called by Aboriginal people themselves, as well as early anthropologists, tribes, or more recent times, First Nations, do have a certain political and social reality, but it's limited in my view. Importantly, language groups do not necessarily provide political units with defined common goals and aspirations and a clearly established leadership. Mind you, I might say that's the case for Australia as a whole now, but let's leave that to one side for today. Members share the identity label, are linked through kinship, may share or assert affiliation with the common language, and may assert in common their connections to particular traditional country. Whether particular families or individuals can be the subject of significant disputation, and they do not necessarily form a stable and cohesive unit for achieving autonomy and self-determination. It is at the lower level, the constituent families, and in some cases even at the local kin group, that, in my experience, people seek to achieve these objectives, that is, autonomy, development, and so forth. Now, that's a moot point that we can discuss. To me, it's what I see and have experienced widely across many, many groups. So I just want to have a little talk now about Aboriginal corporations. There are now several thousand Aboriginal controlled organisations around Australia, ranging from the virtual postbox PBCs to commercial and service delivery corporations with turnovers of millions of dollars. As with non-Aboriginal organisations, there's also considerable diversity in terms of the success or otherwise with which these organisations operate. There's a substantial literature on factors that contribute to successful Aboriginal organisations, but apart from noting it, I won't discuss it here. However, it is important to make the seemingly obvious point that Aboriginal people bring their own distinctive political, social, ethical and other values to bear in their involvement with their own organisations, whether they are running them or seeking resources or services from them. These values have important implications for how the organisations function, most particularly when they aim to represent the interests of or provide services to a diverse Aboriginal constituency, for example, the beneficiaries of a large trust. For example, the typical strong political and ethical commitment to immediate kin and family, referred to earlier, have important implications for Aboriginal boards, including those of trustee corporations. To take just one instance, the legal requirements for a board member to act in accordance with their fiduciary duty to the organisation itself can, and often does, directly conflict with deeply embedded ethical and political obligations of the individual concerned to further the interests of and support their own mob, their own family, and so forth. And I don't think, in passing, that can just be dismissed by the phrase conflict of interest. I don't think that begins to get at the complexity of this intercultural feature. More fundamentally, the entailments of localism and its associated emphasis on individual and local group autonomy and its political and ethical dimensions is that the concept and practice of representation can be seen as quite problematic from within Aboriginal societies themselves. The difficulty that Aboriginal people can have in trusting someone else from outside their own immediate kin, for example as representing their interests on the board, can lead to the destabilising politics of representation. This, in my view, is one of the key reasons why, across Australia, in my experience, and perhaps those of many of you, many Aboriginal organisations are characterised by an absence of trust in the boards, intense competition amongst families and other subgroups, and by corporate histories in which competing factions, typically comprising influential individuals and their families, alternate in their control of the board or fission off to form new corporations. The resolution of conflict by fission. Political conflict in these organisations will often be conducted through manipulation of membership and meeting processes to establish control of boards and therefore of organisational resources. The politics of representation can also be seen sometimes in the attempts by individuals and subgroups within the wider organisational constituency to assert control over the means by which membership of the organisation and the composition of its board are determined. A further and very significant cause of the politics of representation is that representative structures can never truly reflect the nature of the diversity and the shifting alliances which characterise Aboriginal political systems. It is a common mistake, repeated across Aboriginal Australia, including by those of us providing advice on the establishment of Aboriginal corporations, to focus attention largely on capturing this diversity of the constituency in the representative structure itself, rather than focusing on developing mechanisms to ensure that the manner in which the organisation delivers its services, or provides access to trust funds in our case, reflects and incorporates that diversity. That is, I suggest that conventionally, most attention, including that by the beneficiaries themselves, is paid to the governance structures and procedures of the trust corporation, and not enough to the governance of what the corporation's functions are. For instance, how a PBC holding compensation funds in trust for common law holder beneficiaries, quote, applies those funds as directed by the beneficiaries using the language of the PBC regulations. In the next section, I turn to a consideration, a very brief one, of the relationship between a trust, whether a set of individual trustees or a trust corporation, and the beneficiaries, which I see as integral to the ability of a trust to sustainably deliver tangible benefits to beneficiaries consistent with the objects of that particular trust deed. So, my focus on matters relevant to establishing a productive and trusted relationship between a trustee corporation and beneficiaries. I will note here that this applies more to trust funds with substantive resources, not necessarily to small trusts, but we can discuss that later in questions if that's of interest to you. There seem to be few mechanisms in trusts that I've had anything to do with, apart from meetings or grant and loan application processes for beneficiaries to access funds or other support. This would potentially disadvantage those beneficiaries who, for whatever reason, poor education, not politically adept or powerful, not being competent in cross-cultural situations, are less capable or willing to be proactive in accessing funds. One consequence of this, it seems to me, is that those who are the most in need of assistance from a trust have markedly reduced opportunities to access resources from it. This would be particularly the case where larger scale meetings such as the Trust's annual general meetings, to use one example I've had dealings with, provide the primary decision-making forum for the allocation of trust funds. Such meetings provide a highly problematic means for informing and seeking input from members of what are sometimes dispersed and deeply factionalised groups. It's for a number of interrelated reasons, in my view, which are to be found across Aboriginal Australia and in part reflect political and ethical issues discussed previously. And these reasons for why meetings as such are highly problematic as the sole forum to use for this informed consent and decisions and so forth is the following. Firstly, they're very prone to being dominated by those who use them for political strategising and positioning, which means that it's difficult, if not impossible, to ensure effective participation of those who may have equivalent rights but less political standing. Meetings can provide forums which become dominated by grievances which people bring, as it provides the only occasion for them to do so. They usually provide a poor basis for informed decision-making, particularly around complex and technical matters, or contested matters like the distribution or access to funds. They do not facilitate typical Aboriginal decision-making process that I've seen of extended consideration and discussion, involvement of appropriate individuals on the basis of seniority, knowledge and so forth, and consensus building within the local groups, for example families, where such processes have force. This is in part because in aggregating local, highly autonomous and sometimes disputing groups in larger so-called community meetings, they disempower certain beneficiaries and their family groups from effective participation. Meetings are nonetheless a necessary mechanism by which formal ratifications to a proposal can be given by the relevant jural public, that is, the relevant total set of people who have a legitimate right to have and express an opinion on the matters concerned. However, such meetings need to be preceded by a considered and dispersed process of information dissemination, consultation and consensus building, so that the meeting essentially ratifies informed decisions that have been already reached, for instance, with a process of family-based consultations with the aim of building a consensus on issues such as how decisions on trust fund allocation should be made. In Session 2 tomorrow, presented by the Central Land Council's Community Development Unit, along with Wallaby traditional owners, they provide a groundbreaking example of how participatory community development principles have been implemented in the governance of trust funds generated from income streams from Aboriginal lands. Later in the same session, I set out a hypothetical case study, but based on a real example, of how a participatory family and community development process might be established from significant payments flowing from major mining agreement in that case. And there are other contributions to thinking about this arena of governance of what the Trust does as well tomorrow. A consequence of what I characterise as the inherently passive and reactive terms of the relationship between beneficiaries and a trust, as established in the trust deed, can be that many potential beneficiaries are reduced to opportunistic means for getting at least some personal benefits from that trust, for example through fees for attending annual general meetings of the trust and so forth. More generally, the dominant relationship between many of the beneficiaries and many trusts can, I think, be classified as one of opportunistic rent-seeking by the beneficiaries. By this, I mean a constellation of attitudes and actions, including the following: little sense of ownership of the trust, including little direct involvement in its operations or its decision-making processes. Little evidence of commitment of the beneficiaries to a notion of the wider common good to be served by a trust. The evidence seems to suggest that they risk being reduced to seeking instrumental individual or family advantage. Another factor in this kind of constellation of matters is the essential relationship between the beneficiaries and a trust can seem to be, for most, a reactive or passive one. And lastly, there appears to be little or no planning or decision-making in which the beneficiaries themselves can be actively involved. So finally, how might this be addressed? Some background ideas and principles. The following prefigures and draws from my case study that I present tomorrow. A summary conclusion to be drawn from the above is that one key focus of the governance of a trust's activities as a whole should be on the governance of the relationship between the trust and the beneficiaries, including governance of how the trust funds should be applied, not just the internal governance of the trust corporation. Furthermore, to take into account the socio-cultural factors briefly sketched in above, the governance of this relationship should have, I suggest, for discussion, as its guiding principles, first, it should provide mechanisms for active participation amongst the beneficiaries at local and possibly family group levels. It should aim to replace the often reactive and passive relationship between beneficiaries and the trust with one based on active participation and a sense of ownership. It should aim to replace the common situation of opportunistic rent-seeking with structured processes in which people have a meaningful say in the operations of the trust while still maintaining an appropriate mechanism for the relevant level of prudential control of the trust or prudential management of the trust, and determining overall strategic directions for the trust consistent with its objectives. It should provide mechanisms by which the beneficiaries at the levels which are meaningful to them, for example, family groups, can plan for their futures and the role which resources from the trust might play in those futures, and are thus able to move away from opportunistic and short-term seeking for resources to longer-term family and community development perspectives. And finally, it should have a preeminent focus on working with the beneficiaries to build their capacity to make informed choices, not just about how the trust might assist them, but about their lives more generally. It's my opinion that these principles could be implemented, perhaps should be implemented through a participatory planning and capacity development methodology. Examples of how this might be undertaken are set out in a number of the presentations tomorrow. Thank you. In response to a question from the floor, I made the following clarification. The problem with building the formal processes of consultation at the local level into the corporate structures itself is the corporate structures are, as I was arguing there, how they operate as corporations is set out in that 600 pages of the CATSI Act, plus of course, its referrals back to the Mainstream Corporations Act, plus common law, etc., etc. These are enormously constrained, and all the processes that are inside the corporation are subject to the purview of the regulator, for a start. They require codification in order to reduce ambiguity in the rules. There's all these matters. And then there's the overriding issue of trying to reflect the complexity, diversity, etc., of the Aboriginal polity concerned, say, that of the beneficiaries, inside a corporate structure. And perhaps I wasn't clear enough, but what I'm arguing is not that the corporation abdicates its role in that, but that it doesn't build it inside its formal corporate structures, it builds it into how does it do its work. And my analogy always in this is to think about Aboriginal medical services. They will be run by corporations, many of them will be under the CATSI Act, and they will have a whole set of matters that are to do with the operations, including not just the formal governance, how it manages money, who are the members, meetings, etc., but, for example, HR, staff development, professional development, etc., 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 right? But how they deliver their medical service has got nothing to do with the CATSI Act. It's to do with a whole set of other factors. How do they deliver culturally effective and appropriate medical services to their Aboriginal constituents? That sits outside the corporation, but it's fundamentally a role of the corporation, but one doesn't incorporate it into the corporation's governance. That's all I'm saying. And I'm also, secondarily, then arguing that if we really want to ensure that, and this goes to issues which I think Nick will raise in his presentation tomorrow, if we really want these trusts to promote wider issues of equity, to be more resistant, to have people engaged in their own trust rather than passively seeking to access it, and so forth, then there needs to be some creative thinking. And whatsoever it's lying inside the trust with those representative structures, with all the problems that those entail, then it seems to me they're doomed to fail, because it's at the local level, where ethical matters such as trust, having trust in the trust, is a really key issue. The way to achieve that is to work out more creative, thoughtful ways of how a trust works in that sphere, rather than putting them inside the corporation. But they're absolutely the function of the corporation.